live, and it's where the decks from the past sessions live. And so I just put it in the chat for folks that are interested in going back and listening to past recordings. I think you folks, yep, okay, looks like we're recording now.
Yeah. And thank you for clarifying the naming so I could find things. That helped.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and we do have a post like for anybody that might have missed it, just calling out the same details if like if you need to access the link again and look up what the special presentations that are loaded to the UNCLOS are to date. Let me expand this so you folks can actually see what I see. So the other piece on the agenda, I wanted to just do a really quick recap to help frame what we said we would talk about in our next handful of governance sessions. So during our last governance session last week, you know, we kind of came to a conclusion. We want to be able to, in lieu of not having all of the answers right now, to really keep focusing on improving what we do have, refining it, honing in on this kind of use case agnosticism, and using it as an opportunity for us to understand more about the business context of each other's implementations, so that we are making essentially the baseline more leverageable for whatever happens next. Acknowledging obviously that the CA Core Plus work is still very early on, and that one of the items that I think there was interest in having as a standing agenda when it becomes applicable would be reviewing any subsequent materials that come through as things start to kick off for the CA Core Plus. You know, when we talked a little bit about the governance side of things, I think there was a desire to talk about that process of how to, if this is the types of refinements and maybe what we'll see our work look like in the profiling streams, how do we ensure that we're guiding that the best way possible and reflecting on our existing processes for how we've kind of done refinements to date. And so really the core topic of the agenda today is to talk through, you know, what our processes are and what we can incorporate to start to try to address these refinements. I think, you know, a handful of refinements that Thomas referred to last week, and then talking about where we might be missing the mark. So I have a handful of, I know we've talked about them in the abstract before, but really haven't had a chance to actually look at some of the other examples of what nations have put forward in their bases. And so I wanted to kind of frame our discussions today to show, okay, here's a kind of a cross sample. Like, how do we compare to that? And how does that inform, like, whether or not we need to kind of modify or enhance the rigor of our process that we've done to date to remove things that come up in or don't come up in use cases that we see implementations for in Canada.
Yeah, and the CA Core did release governance org chart with their materials last week.
Got it. Okay, well, maybe one thing that we can discuss today is whether or not we want to have like representation from the, like, at least Joel when we have some of these discussions, because I didn't see him join on the call yet.
Joel's probably going to be out of commission until June 5th.
Got it. Okay.
Just had a baby.
Yes.
Just welcomed his little new bundle of joy, Rosalie.
Aww. So, like, I think we can potentially carve out some time to go through that, but maybe it would be a productive, rather than jumping right to it, it may be productive to talk about how do we do those reviews in lieu of having of like not having that backdrop to ask for clarity around. So does it make sense, like, given that Joel will be out, Joni, like, is there anyone on your end that's fielding questions in the meantime that come up in materials that have been released to date, just in that?
Me.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
If you want to send questions to me or post them in the forum, I can make sure that the CA Core team is aware of the questions and.
Perfect, okay.
Be that
And next, Christine, I see you raised your hand.
Sorry, I just got a new laptop and I was just trying to figure out where my mute button was.
Oh,
My apologies. I just wanted to mention, I think the person that was asking the question about the governance is related to at the HL7 Canada presentation when Abby presented on the roadmap. Someone had requested to see I guess a copy of what the new governance structure will be for the interoperability governance that will be following or reporting to the Pan Canadian Health Data Strategy. So I think Abby had said there was a terms of reference that is something that he could potentially share with the community. So perhaps someone from Info could follow up. So Joni, I think you're it.
yeah, because this is, I think it sounds like it's actually then without the it's broader than just the CA core plus governance that
You got
was released. Okay, that's helpful.
And the CA core will fit in it. So the Pan Canadian Health Data Content Framework will sit with the CA core plus, and it reports to the governance as part of this council. So there's quite a bit involved here, but there is an actual structure to this. There's been a lot of work conducted by InfoWay on this with CIHI, and there are 2 tables already in place. So I think he was just saying that there is a terms of reference that can be shared and that he would provide it with the presentation.
Yes, and that question came up when the presentation was given on the 18th. And in response to that session, we got the org chart that Joel sent, but having that terms of reference would be very useful. Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, if you want to send that to me, I can post it into the same thread in the.
Oh, no, I can't share it. I would say that, I'm sorry, I don't want to misrepresent what I'm saying. I'm thinking that I believe Abby said there was a version that was shareable.
So maybe
I'm sorry,
I
I didn't quite catch that.
Joni? So
Yeah, you seem to be, your mic seems to be kind of fading in and out a bit.
what I might recommend, just so that, because I think that this is probably a more of a broader topic than just the CA core, would be, Joni, if you can follow up with Christine and Abby to see what materials have been released and available, and then perhaps we'll look at them at a future governance call if they kind of fall into this piece. Does that seem fair? Just so we can stay on topic.
Sure.
Okay. The other item before I wanted to move on and get into the meat of today was just, I know that as we have obviously been doing a lot more work in our governance stream, and we kicked off the process last year to start our recordings and loading our decks and materials to that own cloud. We had previously discussed whether or not we wanted to start trying to kind of semi-formalize a more secretariat role for recording kind of high level. These are the kind of meeting minutes for what was discussed and decided upon, that is more of a summary to the community. You know, at the time we had kind of assessed, okay, let's start with the recordings and see how it goes, see if there's capacity. So the last piece I just wanted to, I'll come back to it at the end, but think about it while we're talking, would be to see if there's anybody who's interested in even for some of the calls taking on a more secretariat role, if you want to be able to kind of loop back with the community that may not be on the calls through forum posts around what was discussed and decided upon. So I'll come back to that. I'll just ask that somebody remind me 5 minutes before the end if there are volunteers and interest in this. All right. Any questions before we dig in? Okay. All right. So I pulled out this, we use the term use case agnosticism quite a bit for being such a challenging term to say. And I pulled out some context from a prior governance call around kind of assessing this as a potential area that we need to continue making refinements around, and that does produce challenges in our community if we don't nail it and get it right. And one of the things I just wanted to highlight is the need to assess whether or not we have hit the mark now that we're at kind of this maturity level 1. And now that we actually have some comparison points to look at as well. Because when we started, we didn't know how to put, you know, a target on these are the things that are use case agnostic through a different means to that for our community than kind of deducting things that we came across through our due diligence process. But now that we have comparison points, I think it's helpful for us to say, this is what other folks are doing. Like, does this point us into the direction of needing to focus refinements in certain areas and not in others? So I've got actually a couple of these pulled up. So this is a cross section that I tried to pull up that had kind of generic bases that were a mixture of maturity. So the first few I'm going to show are like, I've gone through more cycles. And then, you know, a handful that have gone through a little bit less. I pulled out condition because I think one of the things that is starting to show as a theme in the other national iGuides is that, you know, there are places where iGuides may make different sets of constraints or decisions or base iGuides for entity level resources than for like clinical resources. And so I think this is a good apples to apples comparison because it shows us, okay, for the places where there may be more concern around use case decisions, how do these actually compare so that we can come back and talk about these pieces, which is like, are we hitting the mark? If we're not, where are we not hitting it? And how do we actively try to modify our process to get there?
And as an example, one of the challenges US Corps had was on condition. They had constrained, I believe, to SNOMED because they were focusing on clinical use cases when they defined the profile for condition. And then when the payers came in and billing codes for conditions are totally different than what you deal with clinical codes, that constraint requiring SNOMED had to be loosened. So one of the things that we do tend to fall into is that the first things we look at is clinical usually, and we sometimes forget about the administrative and other uses. Now, our context is different, but we still use different billing codes in Canada than we do for clinical codes on things like condition.
That's a really good point. So that maybe that's something to look at for like specifically for condition. Are we seeing these kind of comparison guides honing in on terminology and being prescriptive about it? Okay. Let me save that. And then I've got a couple that are pulled up here. And we can look at others as well. There's, you know, many that are out there now that we can compare to. So the first one that I've got pulled up right now is the AU base. Important to note, Australia also has an AU core. So what I try to look at is what is the thing that they've self-described as the most kind of use case agnostic. We can look at the core version as well. So it's a higher maturity, like it's at least gone through more than one cycle. And it's, at least for this profile, we're looking at something that has a maturity level of 1. And so what that tells us is, like, at least we're kind of working back from someone who's done a reasonable number of cycles with this in their community to assess kind of what the right layer of constraint should be. And so I think that should be factored into like what we're looking at, because if somebody posted yesterday and they're just still figuring out what their base and baseline looks like, we may want to consider kind of weighting their approach slightly differently. So as well as the context, obviously, that they're operating in as well. But anyway, so I wanted to just point out their condition. When I see this, I see, okay, they've got to focus on bindings. They've got preferred. So it looks like they have defined some value sets, but there's really no must supports or cardinality changes or like conditional cardinality. So rules that are maybe tied to the presence of elements in a data type, for example. So that's a couple things that I'm seeing kind of pop up here. When we open, because to Lorraine's point, we want to understand a little bit about how they have defined some of the pieces that they're pointing to. It would be in, oh, it's okay. So this is pointing, I think, to the value sets that are hosted on their terminology service. Like, to me, clinical condition and clinical findings, I mean, sound like they may be more in line with, I think, the first example you provided, Lorraine, right? Which is like maybe more SNOMED oriented, less about billing, but without access to the value sets, it may be kind of hard. Oh, no, never mind. Just took a second to load. So it looks like they've got SNOMED codes and yep. Okay. So it's a SNOMED value set. So
Yeah, and they're focusing on the clinical side here.
yep. And so, I mean, this is a base. If we go back to their context real quick, so it talks about core concepts, national level agreements. I don't know if they introduce anything that says specifically it's only clinical. Like I know some guides do actually separate the clinical core. I don't know if AU base does.
Yeah, I mean, AU is very similar to us in terms of how they manage healthcare by state.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just run back to this real quick. So our observations are they've chosen to make constraints around terminology, but still keeping them somewhat loose. They've leaned into the more clinical terminology side of things, and they do not touch must supports or cardinality or data types for this profile.
And they don't have any extensions that I can see.
Right, yeah. So actually that brings up our next one, which is, and it may be just this profile, but if we're looking apples to apples, like we do see extension use in the New Zealand guide. And we see it a lot more in some of the other bases that I've got pulled up.
Well, and in this case, the New Zealand guide has not applied any constraints on the value sets
For condition, yep.
for condition, right? They've added some extensions, but they haven't provided any value set binding recommendations.
Yep. So it's really just additive extension at this point. And that's interesting because typically what I've seen in the past is like Australia and New Zealand guides usually are more lined up in terms of what they decide to apply. On the extension front, it may be this one. So the next one that I'm looking at, so I've got the UK core. It's their SDU3. It's a sprint. And actually, let me just make sure. FHIR version R4. Yep. So it's basically, it's their standard for trial use 3, level 3, not SDU 2 or SDU 3 from a FHIR perspective. So we are looking at them apples to apples. It's gone through a number of reviews within their community and trial implementation. We see a lot more introduction of things like extensions that look to be, for the most part, these look, I'm looking at the URL, and they look to be defined, like UK defined extensions. Let's open up their identifiers, because that's a place like within our baseline we touch quite a bit. Sorry, was
Did I
there...
hear Elliot try to talk?
No,
Okay. The other piece I'm seeing here is they're doing some narrowing of reference targets. So they're saying you're going to provide an identifier and you provide an assigner. That assigner should follow the profile expectations for UK core organization. But, you know, similarly, I'm not seeing any like invariants that have been added or cardinality changes. There's some bindings here we can see. And that was on category.
Yeah,
Okay, so it's a UK code system. They're probably, it's interesting because I think of like condition and observation category as being something that's often used for like executing, like filtering off based on a use case, right? So if this is a social history observation or if it's a vital sign observation. And this seems to kind of set up that pattern, but then provides obviously a handful of, well, actually, this is slightly different because these look like codes clinical in nature and to differentiate between a conditions category, whether it's a problem list or if it was something that was added as a diagnosis for an encounter. So this seems, I mean, like, what do you folks think? I mean, is this like, if we were looking at this from an exercise of, is this something we should be doing or something we should be doing differently? Does that feel use case agnostic? Is this something that we should be considering in our approach differently?
well, it looks like here, I would assess that this is trying to, in terms of categories specifically, because that's a specific kind of element. This is trying to define the different use cases they're covering in many ways. We may or may not be there yet.
Yeah.
And it might not be appropriate yet here.
So let's see where else they put bindings. So body type, they put a binding on code. That's a SNOMED.
Yeah, that's the code is the core code of the condition, right?
Yeah.
So they're using SNOMED there, which is clinical. I don't know what they do for their billing tracking, whether they're still ICD or not.
Okay, and then they've got some rules that are, okay, mostly reference target rules. These aren't bindings. More reference targets. It's probably. Okay. So not a lot of places where binding shows up, where
And
it
there's no must support. There's no must supports here anywhere.
Yeah. There's only one that's extensible and the rest are preferred.
Do we know if there's any guidance either in this or the Australian spec around the expectations of having text or display values when codings aren't available?
That's a good question. Let's see. If it, I like sometimes I see that when there's a like a profile data type, but let's take a look at their data type guidance. They have guidance on names that are unstructured, addresses that are unstructured.
They had a codable concept guidance as well in the menu.
Oh, I missed it. Okay. Yes. All right. So this is descriptions, like breaking down the anatomy of the elements and codable concepts with example. Let's see what it says for population. It's more of an example.
And just if you stop at the display, that's I'm just reading. Yeah, and then code.text, which is where I would expect what you're talking about, Thomas. I think that was Thomas that
I think
spoke,
that was that Ken, actually.
or maybe it was Ken.
Yes,
Um,
It's Cam, actually, it's not me.
Sorry, I misheard the voice.
So I'm looking at this, which might speak to,
That's where I would expect that kind of thing to be put, just like it used to be in V3. It was called original text instead of text, but
Well, there's a user selected now for defining, like, if something was the concept that was entered by the user.
So
Um,
that's different than the text displayed. That says, this is the coding that was selected by the user, like this is the drop-down piece. And if we have other codings that are translations, they're translations, they're not what the user selected. The text selected manually entered would be in code.text of that coding. Right?
Yeah, this
Okay,
is
just
the piece
above
that
it.
is like making me wonder. So that might be something. I'm just gonna scroll down just a little bit and then maybe we'll come back to this. Let's see. So this is okay. So this was about Snowman and this was about other codings. So identification of code system.
Yeah, if we scroll further down, there's a title heading, sending a nakipon, sending a concept where the coding system and code is unknown.
I like this. In the exceptional case, things must be different in the UK.
Well, we're looking at Australia right now, aren't we?
No, this is the UK.
Okay.
This is a maybe populated.
Yeah, they're saying populate the text into the code.text.
Yeah, it just seems like they're more, I wasn't expecting them to be this, like optional, this, I can't think of the word, but like not as strict to necessitate it, but it may have to do with their environment if code is very infrequently missing. Or if a coding is infrequently missing.
Well, I mean, we hit those things here all the time. For instance, when in pharmacy, where you've got a compound that's manually made, you don't have a code. You know, those kinds of things. We do this frequently in things other than the condition.
Right. I guess the reason you were asking is like, was it more along the lines of, because is participating in patient summary, one of the things that has been really like a driving force from the global aspect would be to always have a text be present or demonstrable, because you don't always know what the receiving system will be able to support. But
Yeah,
this
that's
seems
exactly
more
right.
optional.
Can you scroll to the very bottom, actually? There's a whole section on the original term text and always displaying the text and always propagating it.
Oh, here we go. Oh, at the very bottom, really
Yeah.
hiding it from us. Okay. Shall always store the original. Intended meaning being altered. Original term text should always include the original. Okay. All right. So I guess that does color it closer to what I was expecting. Which kind of brings up another piece here, like bringing this back to use case agnosticism and like where we have hit the mark and where we haven't. We don't have a lot around our like we have computable expectations around some data types like identifier, but we don't have guidance like this that's around expectations or recommendations. But I do think it does come up in maybe AU base as well. Like it's usually almost always around data types is what I've noticed. Maybe it's just in the AU core. but we can maybe look at that when we go to the other guides to see like what Denmark does, or you know, what other nations do in terms of providing like, if they're not providing data type constraints, how they're providing guidance around certain data type behaviors.
I would expect most of them should be fairly consistent with what we're reading here for the UK.
Let's take a look at what it says for Denmark. Okay, so Denmark is a little higher maturity than us in terms of the cycles that they've gone through. I don't think they've versioned this particular, version this particular profile, but like we're at a 1.1 and they're at a 2.1. So they're a little bit closer to us than Australia or New Zealand or the UK. So here's their condition profile. So we're seeing extensions. We're seeing bindings. Oh no, sorry, that's a binding for an extension. We're seeing bindings on slices, and we are seeing slices on things like coding. I'm not seeing must supports. I'm seeing some conditional, oh no, that's just to say you have to supply a system and here is the fixed system.
Well, there is a required binding there on a specific type of condition code. The second one.
Okay, so there, I wonder if this is a closed slide. It says open by value system. Interesting.
So they're saying that if you provide this type of condition code, it has to be from this set.
Yep. So some conditionality there. Interesting.
Yeah.
And then reference targets have been modified on a couple of these. I'm guessing these would probably be similarly. I go back to the condition profile real quick. Now look at the hybrid view. Yeah, recorder, asserter, like a handful of these are coming up across a couple different sources. But so far, we haven't seen any must support ones. Now, again, there are definitely like other guides out there that have started to dabble in the application of must support, and we can look at that. But I think right now, let's see what they have for. So they've got a little bit about their scope and usage. They've got, let's see what they have for guidance, what types of guidance they have. Intent, they've got their own extensions, but it doesn't look like they have, unless I'm missing something, any guidance like what we saw in the UK guide. They've got examples, and that was something else I saw. A number of these guides have examples of their profiles, which is something we're also missing. So, anything else that we want to look at here in the context of comparison before we look at the CA baseline condition? Okay.
Sorry, just a slow motion here. You hear me?
Yeah, if I can hear you.
Well, just a comment here, just based on my very quick scanning of all those different countries, their base IG there. If you go back, actually, you don't need to go back. Just just only my personal opinion doesn't really reflect the truth. Maybe just for your information. And if you go there, you can see that the UK and New Zealand, the authorities stay at the national level. So with that, my observation, I can tell their authority tone just how to say, implanted into their implementation. However, for Australia, my quick scan shows is a hybrid health system, which is a collaboration between the public and the private. So they have to give some space so they can see how that how to say, authority tone
Yes.
set
Yeah.
inside Australia.
Yeah, and,
Is it-
like,
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
like us, they have some variation between states because health is delivered at the state level, just like we do at the provincial level here.
You're right. And I go to the Denmark, the same thing. So that's where I can tell that the authority, the jurisdiction authority, definitely has a very big impact on the implementation guide. How the implementation guide can be compiled, composed. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think to that point, one thing I do want to call out about the Australian piece. So they do have like a more kind of collaborative, or I guess they have national profiles that are published that will refer back or that like acknowledge the use of the base, but they also have like stricter profiles that are set around like the ADHA. So that's something that's important to also consider. This may be closer to like maybe a core or a use case, or like a, not a use case, but like an implementation if it's around assets. But there's a whole list of all the various guides that are out there. And we've started to try to like basically model them out, like each nation, to see where do they, like, how do they interact with the other guides within their country. And so that context is really important for not just what they decide to put in their guides, but also what constraints they put, right? So if you are AU base and you're expecting that your AU core and a number of your other guides, here, I'll pull up that right now. So if you're expecting a number of things are going to come off of your base, that may lead you to making decisions that are lighter in context, because you know that some of those rules will be distributed, or that there's impacts to the types of decisions that you make if they have to be inherited downstream. So I think that is part of that consideration that has to go in. When we look at ours, we have a couple of areas that don't show up, I think, in these guides. Like if I pull up the Italian guide right now, I did see some must supports used there. Let me see. Oh, do they have a condition? They may not have. So it may be that they apply must supports on, because I was looking at patient as well. And that the type of context or the context of the resource itself in a base may also modify choices about what types of constraints you apply. So an Italian base may not contain condition, but it does contain some of these entity level resources, and may be able to make more stringent rules on those because they're more likely to be reflective of like a person in the context as a citizen, or living in that country with identifiers and with expected information that would be known about them. So I still think that condition is maybe the right comparison point, but I think maybe we do a secondary look at patient as well to see, like, does the answer change if we talk about a different profile? So for ours, we're looking at having some must support flat. We're in the differential, perfect. So we've got application of must support. We have slicing like we saw from, I think that the Danish example. We have, again, required bindings if you fulfill the slice, and then example bindings, like we've got a default slice here that's still clinical in nature. Again, this is a SNOMED code, so that would be more clinical rather than being agnostic for billing. It's commonalities in terms of targets. And I think this, for some reason, I felt like this was, I don't think we applied a invariant, but we may have to check that. I'm just looking at that flag. So when we look at this, at least for the first four, we have commonalities in some places, but I think one of the areas that we immediately start to differ in is this must support piece. And so in bringing this back, we talked a little bit about terminology. Do we think that the fact that must support and, some of the like data type cardinality rules are missing from the others is a reflection of trying to be use case agnostic that we're missing? Like, what do we think what's the driver of that difference that we need to hone in on?
Yeah, we've had a couple of tickets, like BC raised a couple of tickets on practitioner and practitioner role, asking to relax the must support, for example. Now I haven't looked in detail at all the other ones other than it.
The issue is it's going, so this is where use cases where specific business rules get applied. I mean, my opinion is that prior to use case, the implementation guide is stylized to be able to provide, if you will, a generic workflow process, all of the necessary elements to be aligned with consistent representation in terms of what the context is, in terms of greater, not use case, but in terms of concepts, how Canada thinks about different concepts and what's required to represent them appropriately and completely. And then from that point on, so this becomes tricky. Hey, Joni, it becomes tricky, of course, in that there may be some things that the community can agree have to have a certain cardinality regardless of.
Well, for instance, I don't know, I haven't looked at, I don't remember if we have a must support on the patient identifier slice that represents the jurisdictional health number. But I could see in a Canadian-based profile
Yes,
that you would say that that's a must support,
yes,
that you'd be able to handle. It might not be mandatory. It might still be a 0 to star
but you
or
must
0 to
support it.
now, but
Yeah.
you must support it. So there may be some
Mm.
concepts that are really core, but I don't think there's very many of them.
I don't think there are very many either. I think they will typically go to identity, privacy, and even in privacy context, there's some variation. Although I have to say that provinces over the course of their history, particularly in the Infoway days, have aligned very strongly from a privacy security perspective. So it's more likely to be consistent.
Well, there was 2 styles around privacy at least in the V3 days, because Quebec did things differently than everyone
Well,
else.
yeah, of course. Yeah, that's the notable distinction. Yeah.
Yes.
So can we drill into the identifier, you said the jurisdictional health one?
Yeah. So the health card number or whatever it is, the identifier that your jurisdiction recognizes.
Yeah, each jurisdiction calls it something slightly different, but the generic code for it is jurisdictional health number.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I guess if we're exploring, if in your mind, that's one of the places we can say that's use case agnostic. Are we saying that even if you have implementations or use cases where you don't need JHN, that it still merits inclusion?
Well,
'Cause I think we
that's a
kind of
question
suss that out.
I'm trying to think of implementations that don't need JHN. I mean, I can think of instances where you don't have one.
Yeah.
Which is different than where it's not pertinent. I suppose, so I guess the question is, are we thinking about things like peer consumer smart on FHIR apps, that kind of thing? So your Fitbit tracking doesn't need your JHN. So maybe it's not. I mean, but as I was thinking about, provincial health delivery, that was one of the first things I thought of that might be at least somewhat consistent. I don't know what others think about whether we're covering things that don't necessarily need JHN.
Well, so even if, my Apple Watch doesn't need it, if we get into providing that into an EHR, do you need it in order to do that provision?
Well, and we're not necessarily saying do you need it but do you need to be able to understand it? Right? Because requiring it and supporting it are slightly different.
Okay. The other
Right.
one that came to mind was the paramedical services, so massage or physio or whatever, that may not be covered by your provincial program.
Yeah, they likely aren't. And they likely won't have a JHN, so they may not need to support that in their systems. So yeah, so I'm willing to back off on a must support, but that was one of the examples that came to mind where I thought we should think about it and talk about it. But I think you're right, Elliot. We have enough examples that so of course, a massage therapy system probably tracks your private insurance number if you have one, but not your JHN.
Yeah.
Carolyn, I see from this stuff, if we start chopping these things out, what's the point?
You're breaking up.
I can't help that because I've got a wicked cold.
Oh, sorry about that.
But if we take out, the basic things like JHN, what's the point of even having a baseline?
Well, it's not taking out the JHN slicing, right? Randy, you mean like if we don't have a must support flag on it?
Yeah, because
Yeah,
what
we're not
case would you
talking about
have where you?
removing-
Hmm.
Go ahead, Randy.
Just I'm looking from the point of we're trying to support this thing, whether they do anything with it, that's on their side. But we should expect it pretty much all the time, at least in my mind.
Well, pretty much is the question there. Like, because there's difference between all the time and pretty much all the time.
So
Just that if you go in on that side of 99% of the time we need it, 1% we don't, so therefore we don't have it. That's kind of saying our baseline should be matching what the HL7 standard is rather than anything above that.
Yes, well, the HL7 standard doesn't actually say anything about it says you must be able to support identifiers. It doesn't say you must be able to support a specific identifier.
I don't even think it does.
yeah, I think it's optional.
Oh yeah, well,
That's the
well,
point.
optional and must support are different. Yeah, but yeah,
We kind of
actually,
want to actually say
There's nothing in the core spec that's must support.
that I was going to say that I realized that after I spoke. Thanks, Elliot.
Thomas, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just don't want to talk together with that folks. I only can give some example here as a really use case perspective to show maybe one example how the GHN could play or not play should be as must support here. In Alberta Health Services, and sometimes they have to handle very unique cases, and some people on the street been sent in, and they need to be treated first. This is very important. This is for patient safety. This is the always higher priority. In that case, they need also to manage, I call it manager, their health information system. In that manner, they prepared a set of code. They call it code, so they can put inside the JHN whatever rotation way. And sometimes, with this cases during the winter time, it comes out and they run out that code very quickly. So that means within the 1 to 2 days, I just guess you run out all those code set. So they have to increase the length of the code so they can put inside. With that matter, JHN here, it does attribute still exists, but the value of the attribute has been, I use the word been maneuvered. So I only can provide this as a use case, but regarding treated as must support or not, it definitely need the community to discuss it.
And like, I wonder if maybe as a community, this is something that we can drill into is like, are we only concerned about refinements that are related? Like if we were to remove must support, are there other types that we're worried will erode that value.
Mhm. Yeah, and Thomas, from my memory from when I was working in Alberta, you have, there's many people who have ULIs, unique lifetime identifiers. Not all ULIs are actual PHNs, because not everybody with a ULI is eligible for coverage by AHS. So there's the identifier piece and the eligibility piece, which are sort of wrapped up in those identifiers and are handled in behind in the systems. Because not all ULIs are PHNs, but
They are all JHNs.
all PHNs are ULIs, but not all
Right.
ULIs are PHNs.
Right,
Yeah.
but all of our ULIs are JHNs
But
effectively
I'm gonna-
because they're
They are,
doesn't
yeah.
identify the person in the system.
I'm gonna
And in the case that
try
Thomas
to
is talking,
bring
sorry,
this in, because like really, this is maybe more context about whether or not we should apply to must support rather than like the process wise. And I'm just
Mhm.
conscious of time. I think if we do come to it to like through this process of refinements, making that decision, I very much welcome like
But-
calling out the use cases, but
I think where we got to at the beginning of this was that there are a few items like this that might be worth exploring for more specific constraints, but most of them in the baseline probably should not be must support. I think where we got there. So we have a few real, very core basic concepts, but I think that's the exception rather than the rule.
and
That's
so
where we started the conversation, right?
yeah. And so I've got I've gotten some maybe use case buckets that maybe are like, they're not fringe, but speak to this question of like, if we can name a number of these, even if we don't have an implementation guide to see them, that they don't have these constraints, like, is that how we want to move forward in terms of like removing some of these must support rules? I think one question that I have is like, should we attempt to try to set a target or continue to try to get at it more organically through like challenge, basically challenges, maybe not DDR challenges, but like challenging through a process where we bring up these use cases and see if they would modify the constraints that we've made. So does it make sense for us to continue that conversation about like mostly about the process wise, right? Which is like, do we want to start talking about removal of some of these? What's the concern if we do, and what it would be our manner of doing it, with maybe a handful of the examples that we use today? Does that seem like a reasonable place to pick up? What would be our next governance, which is probably not going to be until the end of May. But does that seem reasonable? If there are other ideas that folks have that you want to get in before our next governance call for how we set a target that is reasonable and thoughts on impacts to users, I would welcome them in the forum. We'll scan for them before and we'll pick up, I think, on our next call, just digging into this a little bit more, because I think what we're hearing is there's got to be more nuanced than what we're doing. Sound fair? And then we'll see everybody else on the profiling end on next Friday to start doing the work of getting through the remainder of changes that we need to do. And I didn't get to this, but nobody warned me, so we'll have to ask next time. If you're interested, let us know in playing more of a secretarial role. We'll just keep asking for the next couple sessions. All right. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Have a good
Thank
weekend.
you.
Have a good
Cheers.
weekend.